Hi, you're listening to Dusk to Dawn, reading horror and weird fiction. We're your hosts, Amber and Dan. Read the episode's book first if you don't want any spoilers, because we're full of them.
We also talk about sensitive topics. This is a horror podcast after all, and we swear a lot. Well, Amber does. Find any trigger warnings in our episode notes. We're happy you're joining us, and enjoy the show. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 7. This is the 7th.
Wow. Great start.
Shit. Okay. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we are discussing The Fisherman by John Langan for our 7th episode. I can't believe it's already April now, and we started this end of last year in December, and look how far we've come.
Yes, the months tend to move on.
Yes, Dan, time moves forward.
It has a tendency to do that, sometimes faster than you want. But...
Yeah, true enough. Okay, so this book is a book that I like, and so we're talking about it today. I think I've mentioned it in 2 other podcasts as when I was reading it, and then how I wanted to talk about it, and now we're talking about it. So it's good to just get it out of the system, right?
Sure.
Should we go right into it? Wait, no, hold on. No. I want to say a couple things here. So one of the cool things about having podcasted for over 3 months now is that we get stats for our listeners, like where they're listening from, essentially. And we have listeners from all over the world. I'm not going to say how many, but we are an international podcast. So thank you to people we don't know from places we have not been to. That's really cool. I hope you're listening to it and enjoying it, and keep listening to it.
And also thank you to the people that we do know who are listening.
Yeah, thanks guys.
Yeah. We also appreciate you, believe it or not.
All right, so let's talk about the author. John Langan is the author of 2 novels, The Fisherman and House of Windows, and 2 collections of stories, The Wide Carnivorous Sky and Other Monstrous Geographies, Mr. Gaunt and Other Uneasy Encounters, and Children of the Fang and Other Genealogies. With Paul Tremblay, he co-edited Creatures, 30 Years of Monsters, and he's one of the founders of the Shirley Jackson Awards, for which he served as a juror during his first 3 years. Currently, he reviews horror and dark fantasy for Locus Magazine. He lives in New York's Hudson Valley with his wife, younger son, and many, many animals. He teaches at SUNY, New Paltz. We know someone who is taking a writing program at SUNY.
That's right, we do.
He's working toward his black belt in the Korean martial art of Tong Soo-do. So I guess he's got some extra time. That's cool.
I actually just was talking to a friend of mine who also is applying to go to SUNY. So.
Oh, yeah? Cool. Apparently, there's been some really good creative writing teachers there. Is that what they're known for? Do they do other things too?
I don't know. All I know is my friend is hoping to get into I believe the Germanic writing program.
Like writing in German language?
I think so. I don't know. I didn't actually ask. Now I feel like a jerk. Thanks.
All right. Well, give us a little synopsis of the book then.
In upstate New York, in the forest around Woodstock, Dutchman's Creek flows out of the Ashokan Reservoir. Steep-banked, fast-moving, it offers the promise of fine fishing and of something more, a possibility too fantastic to be true. When Abe and Dan, 2 widowers who have found solace in each other's company and a shared passion for fishing, hear rumors of the creek and what might be found there, the remedy to both their losses, they dismiss it as just another fishy story. Soon, though, the men find themselves drawn into a tale as deep and old as the reservoir. It's a tale of dark pacts, of long-buried secrets, and of a mysterious figure known as Der Fischer. It will bring Abe and Dan face to face with all that they have lost, and with the price they must pay to regain it.
So yeah, I chose this book because my name's in it, and that's it. End of podcast.
Easy peasy.
It was cool. Go read it.
Sorry, we cannot complete this podcast because we have gone fishing.
So after reading this book, there's a few things we definitely want to talk about. We're going to hit up in today's episode. We're going to talk about grief in the story because that's a major theme. Several people have lost other people the Lovecraft cosmic horror influences that are pretty obvious, but also kind of show up in subversive and not so obvious ways that we might usually expect from cosmic horror. The shifting of stories and storytellers. We have people who are relating stories that they heard from someone who heard it from someone, and then they're writing it down. So there's
heard it through the grapevine.
How stories shift. And then, is this literary horror? Is it cosmic horror? Does anyone give a shit? Is it just a cool book? We're going to talk about that for a little bit too. And I'm going to read some quotes that I like. I think I'm just going to mush them all in one part and just be like, here's some quotes that are cool. And finally, does the story structure work, or did you think it was effective? We have a framed story here, and it's framed in a pretty interesting way that we'll get into. So those are the main topics we're going to be talking about today, and let's get right into it.
I want to hear your first impressions, or I guess you read this at least twice, so your first and second impressions of this book.
Okay. I actually read it 1 3/4 times. And I really liked it. This is a book that I wanted to talk about, and I've mentioned it in previous episodes. We finally got around to it, and some of the things I really like about it, primarily the writing. It's just very careful, precise prose, and going back to it a second time it feels like you're digging in a little deeper. So it's got that literary quality in terms of a text you can go back to and dig more out of in a repeated reading. And one of the characters' name is Dan, so that's cool. Also, fishing in New England just like immediately puts me in the headspace of, oh, it's literature, because I think of Ernest Hemingway and how he's like,
oh yeah,
he loved writing fish stories.
It actually reminded me a little bit of The Brothers K by David James Duncan, which we read a long time ago. And you pointed out when I mentioned that I was actually thinking of his other book, The River Why. But I think, yes, that's true. But I think that this style of writing, and I don't know, it just like his vibe reminded me of Duncan's vibe.
Yeah, I could see that. Going back to Hemingway, it's like he had that famous short story, The Big Two-Hearted River. And I think fishing is just like works well with literature because it's rife with metaphor, right? I mean, that's the Big Two-Hearted River is a character who comes back from World War I, and you don't know that at all. It's just a character who goes fishing, and he comes across a town that's like half destroyed from a fire, and he fishes, and he like kills crickets and observes them and says like 2 lines through the whole story, and nothing is mentioned about his war past, but it's the whole idea of the iceberg that anyone who's taken a creative writing class has probably heard about. Only show the very tip of a very large iceberg that can be seen and read between the lines. And fishing just has like those kind of metaphors that are ready to tackle big ideas on a fish hook, I guess.
But if you fuck it up, it'll be a sinking ship like the Titanic.
Also, it's cosmic horror. I think it was the last episode, I'm pretty sure, in Such Lovely Skin, when you asked me my favorite horror, and I've had time to think about that, and I think it might be cosmic horror. Let's talk a little bit more about that when we talk about what kind of horror book this is, though.
Sounds good.
How about you? What are your first impressions?
I enjoyed it. I listened to this instead of reading it. I started reading it, and I had a lot on my plate, and I just didn't feel I was going to be able to focus on a book sitting down and reading it. So I listened to it, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't really like the narrator, which I hesitate because I don't like saying that because I don't know. I instantly feel guilty, like, oh, he's fine. But he just didn't mesh with me. And actually, I read a couple of places other people have agreed with my thought there. And I don't know if that really has a strong influence or not, but I felt at times that it dragged on a bit, and I found myself like my thoughts wandering, and I had to go back and reread some parts just to make sure I understood what was going on. But overall, I did enjoy it. I liked it a lot, and I would Yeah, I would read it again, but not listen to it again.
We should say that we had a friend who had also listened to it and liked it, but he mentioned that he read it physically recently and thought it was 100% better.
He also mentioned that he thinks that some of the text was changed.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In the audiobook, which that kind of surprised me because I recently was studying book publishing, and one of the things that came up with audiobooks was, at least with Amazon, they want you to have it exactly the same. They have some program. I don't listen to books on Amazon, so I don't know what it's called, but there's some way that you can go from your Kindle to an audiobook and back and forth. It knows where you are, so it needs the text to be the exact same as the spoken word, and then it tracks where you are and can switch it around. With that being said, depending on when this was recorded, that would be very surprising if they did that, because it's just not standard.
He also mentioned that he felt like the dialogue tags were more noticeable in the audiobook. Like, he felt like they'd say, he said, they said, whatever, too often, because through hearing it, it's like he understood that the voice was changing. So maybe it hadn't been changed, but it didn't quite work out in the same form of, because when you're reading it and you see he said or they said or whatever, it feels like you can kind of just like almost skip past that.
Yeah.
Where if it's being read aloud, you notice it more.
Yeah, but that's never bothered me really in the past. But also, I feel like this narrator didn't really do voices for the different characters, at least not as noticeable as I have seen in the past. So it was interesting to only have listened to it and then unfortunately not mesh with the narrator, and it kind of took away from my experience. But that also is an interesting thing to be able to talk about. What is the difference between an audiobook and a physical book?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about this story is its structure, in that we have a framed story, but it's not like a lot of framed stories where there's maybe like, I don't know, the classic example is Turn of the Screw, right? Like they're all around the fireplace and their characters are like, I have a story to tell you. And then one character says, well, let me tell you this story. Then they go into the Turn of the Screw. And interestingly, it doesn't have a frame on the opposite end, but it's like a quick thing, right?
Or the Decameron.
Yeah, but
I like that example better.
Yeah, the Decameron or Canterbury Tales. The idea of like, there are people telling a story and we're going to have that part of the story, but that's usually minor. It kind of sets the scene, where in this book, it's, I think the first 50 to 100 pages, somewhere in there, is the story of the two main characters in the present time, Abe and Dan. And Abe is an older character. He's, I don't know, 12 years older than Dan or something.
Yeah, about that.
And it starts out with Abe, who has lost his wife, but it's like 10 years ago. And then his coworker, Dan, at work loses his wife and his kids in an accident. And so he's like fresh in grief. And they end up forming a bond together as fishermen. And then in the middle of the story, they have somebody tell them a story, right? And that's like the middle third of the book is a different story. And it's really crazy because
it feels like the majority of the book is that story.
Yeah, like Abe and Dan are doing their thing and they're about to go fishing, and they go to a diner and some guy's like, it's raining really bad outside. So the guy at the diner's like, let me tell you a story. And I remember reading it and being like, this is a long story. And then actually flipping through the book and it's like, oh, the story that's being told in this diner is longer than the story around it, but the story around it still is, encompasses 100 to 150 pages total of these two characters who hear it. So it's really interesting. And I feel like it goes well with the fisherman theme of telling tall tales, right? Like, let me tell you a story. It's going to take several hours to listen to.
Have you ever read Moby Dick?
Speaking of, I did listen to a podcast interview with John Langan. He mentioned Moby Dick is the main book he had in the front of his head when he was thinking about this. but also Pet Sematary by Stephen King. And he mentioned Ghost Story by Peter Straub, which I have not read.
Oh, we're coming back to Stephen King. We're already pulling in the previous reads.
I'll do a quick read of the first couple sentences of the book. Right away, I was struck by the similarity to Moby Dick. Don't call me Abraham, call me Abe. So what's the famous line in Moby Dick? Like,
call me Ishmael?
Call me Ishmael, yeah. Don't call me Abraham, call me Abe. And that brings to mind the call me Ishmael.
Me Ishmael, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. There's little things like that.
Also, speaking of Moby Dick, because 'tis the season, First Contact Day is coming up.
Actually, First Contact Day happened.
It will have passed by the time this is published, but yeah, there's a really great Moby Dick quote scene with Captain Picard in that movie.
Do you know the quote off the top of your head from the episode or the movie?
Oh man, I used to know that movie line for line. I know it, but I'd have to say it like with Patrick Stewart.
Oh, and yeah, I can picture the scene now. They're like by the model of the Enterprise, right?
Yeah, and then she's like, "You broke your little ships." I just love that movie so much. I'm very excited for First Contact Day. So, sorry, Moby Dick tangent, of course, leads to Star Trek because, hi, it's me.
All right, so let's talk about the theme of grief in this story because that seems to be. What would you agree the overarching theme? I mean, we have two characters who lose their family, and then they're told a story about a family who experiences loss, which also includes another family of a mother who gets lost.
Yes.
So,
and also loss of a home because they're destroying a town in order to make a reservoir for New York City. So people are losing their homes and their livelihoods, and on top of, yes, people just dying, which... Yeah,
the big theme...
I agree, yes, it is definitely the main theme.
And how do you feel like it handled that? And because there are two major stories within this book, do you feel like the frame or the inner story did a better job, or how did you feel?
I felt that the frame did a really good job. I appreciated the way that Abe talked about how he was reacting to Dan and his grief, because at some points he says, "Oh, you would think I would know exactly what to say, or that I would have gone right to him after his family died, but I didn't." And I feel that that was very realistic, because even if you know someone really well or not, you don't know how to approach them when it comes to grief, and everybody's grief is different, right? As Abe points out, he knew his wife was going to die and they had time together, whereas Dan's family died in an instant, and it's a completely different kind of grief. Just because they both lost their wife doesn't mean it's similar at all. And that's the situation, and then also how people react to things. So I thought that was really well done. It brought up some interesting thoughts for me of my recent past dealing with grief. So I appreciated that. With the story within, I thought it did it more. I thought it did still a good job, but in a completely different, I guess I want to say a less realistic way. It didn't hit me as true as the relationship between Dan and Abe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the central story takes place in, I don't know, 100+ years ago too, right? So it feels more distant. You're more distant from the characters, and it's not in first person point of view anymore.
And it felt a little more like an immigrant story than a story of grief, because, you know, all these people are coming from all over to do this work, and people can't communicate, for instance, because they don't speak the same language. So there's a lot of cultural exploration in that story as well that deters from the focus of grief, whereas I feel with Abe and Dan, it's pretty much all that they talk about, that and fishing. But why are they fishing? Because they're in this state of intense grief, and this is their escape. So
yeah, and they're co-workers at IBM. And what's interesting is when Dan's family suddenly dies in the accident. Like, he's a model employee who gets there early and stays late and is always crisp and clean and stuff. But when his family dies, some cracks start to show. And at first, Abe doesn't go to him, even though he has been through the experience of losing his wife. But like you said, she died of cancer and they knew about it. It's also been years since it happened. And he doesn't talk to him right away. But one of the ways that he has coped with his own grief is through fishing, kind of just randomly. He says he didn't really grow up fishing. He goes a couple times with his dad, but one day just wakes up and is like, I'm going to go fishing. And loves it.
And he does.
And he does. And he goes every weekend and on weekdays. And it's, just...
And by going every weekend, it's like, get up, get there before the sun rises, leave after the sun sets on both days. Like,
yeah.
It's literally all that he does.
And one day he's talking to fishing with somebody else at work, and Dan comes up.
He was telling a pretty funny story about trying to catch a fish while I think he was taking a shit in the bushes.
He was. Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if he was peeing or taking a shit, but his pants were down around his ankles, and he's
because he reached for a leaf or something.
Yeah, that's right. And he's pulling this fish in, and he gets the fish. He's all excited. And then he looks up, and there are these two, I think, older women on the other side of the bank or whatever, watching him, just laughing because he's fishing with his dick hanging out. It's a great visual. It's pretty hilarious.
Yeah, so he's telling this to somebody else at work, and then Dan overhears it. And, Dan hasn't spoken a whole lot since he lost his family, but he's just kind of like, oh, fishing, and says, I don't know, I've always wanted to.
I used to go with my dad when I was a kid. Yeah.
So Abe invites him, and that's how the story starts. And I'm kind of leading up to one of my favorite descriptions about grief, because I think they start going fishing in the fall, and he's like, we don't really talk to each other, but he shows up, and we kind of just sit there and fish and are next to each other, right? And one of their rules is an unspoken rule is they don't really talk about their families. I mean, they kind of do, but it's not like, so, how are you holding up with all this?
It's not a therapy session. They exist within the realm of where it's something that happened and they acknowledge it, but they're not sweeping it under the rug, but they're not discussing it in depth.
Yeah. So they have their fishing relationship throughout the fall, and then it gets to be winter. And at this point, I think it's the year anniversary is coming up of the death of Dan's wife and kids. And like, they can't fish during the winter. The season is ending. And even Abe has always struggled during this time. He's tried to find a winter hobby, but just nothing hits him like fishing. So he's always had a difficult time. He ends up inviting Dan over to his house for dinner. And Dan gets like super drunk and just gets, goes out there and is showing signs of like the depths of his grief.
And this takes place, I believe, in February. Right?
Yeah, this is February. And there's this really cool passage. There's a lot of cool passages in this book. I actually had to like stop noting quotes that I wanted to read because it'd be boring if I just kept reading out of the book. And I also needed to read instead of writing about what I was reading. Anyhow, there's this really interesting line about going into the second year of grief, because the first year is, I don't know, such a shock and so raw. And it's happened so suddenly that maybe the argument is your brain still is thinking this, I don't know, they could come back or whatever it is. There's first year is so raw. But then here's the quote. They say that for most people, the second year after you lose someone is harder than the first. During that first year, the theory goes, you're still in shock. You don't really believe what's happened to you has happened. You can't. During that second year, it starts to sink in that person, or in Dan's case, people you've been pretending are away on a visit aren't coming back. This wasn't what happened to me, but I guess that was because I'd been losing Marie for a long time before she was gone, and so had been using a lot of those same tricks on myself most folks don't discover until much later. But the theory held true for Dan. He'd made a brave face of things through Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year, had done his best to be a good host to his various visiting relatives, and once the last of them, a cousin from Ohio, had been gone for going on a week with no promise of anyone else appearing in the immediate future. The knowledge of how alone he was had crushed him like a truck full of bricks. Isn't that just some nice writing?
Yeah, it's really fucking sad. But
It's so sad, but
it's very well
I'm reading
written.
it, I'm like, so yummy sadness.
Oh, God.
And so this is really the impetus for them taking up fishing again once the winter season is over. And then Dan is the one who brings up Dutchman's Creek or Fisherman's Creek or one of its other names.
But I want to stop you there and go back to the dinner, because at that dinner, as Dan's going on in his tirade and incoherent drunk speak, he ends by saying, "What's underneath the mask?" and then promptly passes out in the chair. And I thought that was an interesting way to leave that conversation, because you can take that obviously as, you know, people hiding under their mask of happiness when they're really struggling, or smiles, or, you know, whatever, facial expressions or demeanors. But you can also take that as potentially a foreshadowing of what we're going to learn about the actual story of Der Fischer too, because it's like an alternate reality kind of thing that we get sucked into.
Yeah, with cosmic horror, it's kind of like the mask is the mask of the world, right?
Yes, yeah.
Or the mask of reality as we know it or think it is.
Also, I love that Abe calls February an especially bleak month, which is the month I'm born in. So I appreciated that. It made me chuckle.
I've come to think that a bit since we moved to Oregon, just because February is the month where it's like the sun comes out, just kidding. Sun comes out, just kidding.
Yeah.
And it's just like, God damn it, stay sun, please.
Yeah, I've come to learn that it quite possibly will snow after my birthday, which is early February. And I'm like, excuse me? No, it's supposed to be sunny. But anyway, also after that dinner, when Abe goes to sleep that night, he dreams that he's fishing, and he fishes up Marie's dead body. And she says something like, "Der Fischer," which doesn't make any sense. And of course, my brain's like, "Oh, Der Fischer." Yeah, that's an Americanized version of that, mumbled in a person who's got a bunch of water in their face. I can see that.
There's a lot of that in this book. There are people who talk and they have it sounds like gurgling, choking water.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I thought that was a very pivotal scene for so many reasons in this book, because it talked about grief. Like, you know, we tore the Band-Aid off and saw Dan in his most desperate state. It really showed how important fishing was to them, because since they weren't able to, they weren't getting that release. And then also there's some really good foreshadowing of the future story that we're going to impart on.
Yeah, and that was the only time Dan ever came over for dinner, too.
Can't imagine why.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. Two men can be difficult. Yeah, I don't know.
One man can be difficult. Let's be honest.
But they do end up going back on their fishing trip. There's kind of an awkward time after this dinner where...
Well, yeah, they don't talk about it, and then Abe just assumes that Dan's not going to come, and then Dan's like, "Oh, he's just there, right?" And then they just, as men do, they get back into their normal routine without commenting on it. Just, okay, let's go fishing then. Wait, you're not even going to talk about anything? Just, okay, whatever. So after they have this momentous dinner, this pivotal point in their relationship, they pick up fishing again when the season starts. And at one point, Dan suggests they go to Dutchman's Creek, which Abe had never heard of. They go to Herman's Diner on the way, and it turns out to be an incredibly rainy day. And they get a story from someone at Herman's Diner, which is an incredibly long story. And as someone who listened to the book, this story would have taken like 5 hours to tell. So I'm surprised they got any fishing in that day. But this story is the central point of the book. This is
the anchor to the fishing story.
Goodness. I think our trigger warning needs to be
fishing puns. Bait and switch could be a trigger warning.
Oh, yikes. Speaking of, so we think that we're getting this one story about Abe and Dan, and now all of a sudden we are 100 years in the past, and we are meeting up with Rainer and his family, who moved from Germany to start working on a reservoir that's going to be built for New York City. And this is where all the weird Lovecraftian shit goes on.
Yeah, and the impetus for the story, besides them just being in a diner on a rainy day, is that when Dan mentions wanting to go to Dutchman's Creek, the owner's like, whoa, back up there. Let me tell you a story about that place. The owner of the diner tells the story, which he heard from a reverend, which he heard from one of the characters in the story, and is now being written down by Abe. So it's not technically, like, he writes it as if it's Herman telling the story, but it is him writing it later and adding more details. So it's just a small thing where it wasn't actually being told like a 5-hour story, but also where else would he have gotten all the details? So I think they were commandeered in that diner for hours.
But also after the story, when we get back to Abe, he mentions a part of the story and says, oh, well, actually, that detail wasn't in the story that was told to us. And I'm like, wait, what? what do you mean?
So he's adding in.
So it really made me go back and question, like, wait, how much of the story was the story and how much of it was Abe going back and adding to it, which I thought was really clever. It was a really clever writing technique.
While Abe and Dan's story has like hints of something deeper going on or foreshadowing of cosmic entities, this is like, for example, the dream that Amber mentioned Abe having about his wife as a fish. This central story is like all Lovecraft influences worn on his sleeves, right? So we have, and I guess maybe I should go over this because have you read any Lovecraft?
I have read a comic version of The Call of Cthulhu.
Okay. All right. Well,
and I might have read some other stuff in the past, but I don't remember. But I am obviously familiar with Lovecraftian lore and styles and stuff. It has come up in other things, but I never really picked up Lovecraft, and part of that is, you know, we all know why.
Bad reputation is,
bad reputation.
Yeah, there's definitely some controversy with him, well earned. But in terms of his establishment of cosmic horror and the connections in this book, there's a character, Otto Schocken, who's a painter. And this is classic. Might even been in Call of Cthulhu, but I think Lovecraft uses this technique a few times where there's a character who witnesses like an entity of the cosmic forces. Well, but I'm jumping ahead. Okay, so first of all, to kick off the frame story, we have this character, Rainier. Rainer. Oh, yeah, I guess that would be right. And
Rainier is a beer.
That's probably why I said it that way. And he is like an eminent professor. University. Is it Heidelberg or am I making that up? I might be making that up.
Yeah, it is Heidelberg actually, which is cool because I know people who've gone to Heidelberg University.
That's really cool. And yeah, he's an eminent professor of languages and old cultures. And something happened which we don't know about. It's discovered throughout the book. We get more and more. But something happens where he basically becomes a pariah and has to leave.
It's a little Dr. Frankenstein-ish.
Yeah, it is a little bit, right? He's researched something he shouldn't have researched, and some things happen, and he's got to get out of Germany. So he moves his family to America, and they go to his wife's sister's bakery to live there for a little bit while they're figuring things out. And then he discovers the opportunity to go work on the dam as a stone worker, which he has not done. But because he's a clever professor, he's able to talk to the people in charge and convince them that he does know what he's talking about. It also helps that he knows several languages quite well, and so he can talk to workers from different countries on the project. But we just know that he left, something bad went down.
Yeah, something sus, as my son would say.
Something sus.
Well, then they move into this tiny little place, and their neighborhood is full of people who are also immigrants. A lot of people can't talk to each other. Some people speak Turkish, some people speak German, some people speak English, some people speak none of the above and other languages, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a mix of people, and various levels of community are formed. And one day, one of Rainer's daughters sees their neighbor Helen get run over by a mule team on the way home from the end of the day. They would race them down the hill kind of thing, and she just stepped out in front of them. And it's concluded that was suicide, because they talk about her burial rites and whether or not she's allowed to have them. So they at least assume that she did it on purpose. And then Helen, she just had to go and make it fucking weird. Actually, her husband did.
Yeah, he's the one who made it weird. So we get another backstory, and this is like a book with lots of nested narratives within it.
It makes it a little difficult.
Yeah, it makes it hard, right? Because normally we've kind of come to the idea that we don't want to recite too much of the stories that we talk about.
Yeah, you can go and read it,
But it's kind of hard not giving any context, and because the nesting of this narrative is so layered, we kind of have
it's like an onion.
Yeah, we got to work through it a little bit. So there's this character called the Guest who came into this area, I don't know, a long time ago to visit somebody named Cornelius Dort. And Cornelius Dort was a very rich, very cantankerous, hostile character who made a bunch of money and was known by everybody in this area. And he was actually fought the hardest against having the reservoir built here, and was like, no, don't let the New Yorkers take advantage of us. We don't want this. And so one of the interesting details is, like, by the time he dies, he is well renowned by everybody, because while he had been mean to everybody else, he then ends up being mean to the people who want to like strip their towns away from them. And so he becomes a hero because his cantankerousness like gets directed at a common enemy. So that was interesting.
Your enemy is my friend, or
wait, the enemy of my the friend of my enemy is my friend too.
No.
Wait. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's some version of that. You get what we mean.
But Cornelius Dort's wife had died, so it's another character who lost somebody in their life, and the Guest comes and stays with him, and everyone's like, what the heck? Because Dort would usually kick anybody out of the house, just like, get the heck out of here. But this character stays with him, and then people start seeing his wife, including one of them being a painter, and this is classic Lovecraft, named Otto Schocken, who is traveling through and sees Dort and like a ghostly figure of his wife at night, and he ends up painting the picture of just the wife in like a all black clothing, as if there's a ocean behind her, and he draws the picture and gets some fame and then goes crazy and kills himself, which is Lovecraft loves doing that, having like a creative character who's overtaken by madness and then creates something astounding and then loses it and ends their life. So that's definitely a call out there.
I also like Rainer's description of the Guest. He calls him ein Schwarzkünstler, which literally would translate to a black artist, which is from German folklore. And the way that Rainer describes a Schwarzkünstler is someone who slices into the surface of things and peels it away to discover what is underneath. Pretty cool.
I mean, right there, I feel like that's cosmic horror right there, is this idea of
it's
like...
also this book, because we were just saying how there are layers and layers. And
Absolutely. It's true.
A whole nother layer.
So then we have, so there's the guest who stays in the house. And once that guest has arrived, who's like wearing all black and...
Because he's a Schwarzkünstler.
Right. And is seen around the property and all that. It's discovered there's something weird going on, but they're mostly left alone. And then one of these workers, his wife, goes out and gets trampled by the mule team, and she's dead. So this character knows about the guest and that story of Cornelius Dort's wife being seen after she had died. So he ends up, I guess, going there. We don't see it, but he essentially finds a way.
He obviously does.
Yeah. He finds a way to resurrect Helen, his wife, who was just trampled. And she comes back. And one of the cool things about this story is that she comes back and everyone sees it. Like, she does it during the day and her bones are grinding because she got trampled by mules. So
she's walking all funky.
Yeah.
Clearly her body is broken.
And wherever she walks, she leaves huge puddles of water. And when she talks, it's kind of like a garbled, wet sound, and she has golden eyes. But she goes back home, and her husband
and everyone's
George,
like, "All right,
yeah." And her husband George
just
is like,
another day.
"Hey, kids, mom's back home." And the kids had been staying with Rainier and the family because George, the husband, was in a bad way after his wife got trampled, right? But then he comes in the middle of the night and is like, "Wake up the kids! A miracle has happened. Come check out your mom." And she's like horrifying.
Oh, hi, Mom.
Yeah. I mentioned that I listened to the interview with John Langan, and he brought up Pet Sematary as a big influence. So there's the Pet Sematary, right? Bringing back somebody from the dead, and it doesn't quite work out the way you want it to.
Of course not. Duh. Like any kind of folklore or anything. Yes, it doesn't work. Please, listeners, do not try to raise the dead.
And Helen causes all kinds of trouble. She tries to get her kids back, but obviously the neighbors are like, no, because you should be dead. And George ends up going fucking nuts because he's just hanging out with his dead wife. And things aren't going well, but Helen is just like walking around this place. People don't really know what to do about her. All they really know is that Rainier was a scholar and can speak many languages and has some ancient funny books.
Rainier's a beer.
We should have gotten some Rainiers.
Oh, quick,
shit.
Pause the recording.
Yeah.
No, it's Rhino.
Rhino.
Sorry. Anyway.
I guess we could keep doing this because this is this kind of story, but this is all leading toward there's something weird going on here. And here's, a professor from Germany who seems to know some things about old languages. We need his help to get to the bottom of this. And what this is the Schwarzkünstler in the region, and things happen. And it's pretty cool. I mean, Rainier gets a group of men together and tries to solve this. And I think Rainier's wife on the second reading of this book is my favorite character because she's like, listen, dude, you need to figure out what's going on. Go read your black magic books. Like, get some shit. Fix this shit. Get
off your ass and get something done. This lady is making way too many puddles and it's creepy.
Yeah. So they do that and...
they end up at the ocean. I thought that was fascinating.
Wait, what do you mean? Go on.
Just, they're in the middle of this. It felt like they're in like upstate New York. And then like a chapter later, they're at an ocean. You're like, wait, what?
Yeah, they end up going to the house at the station, which is this village is called, the old Cornelius Dort house or estate, where the guest still lives after Dort died, which was caused quite a fuss, but the guest is pretty scary and no one wants to tell him to leave. And the people who do try to tell him to leave can't get a hold of him, right? So they do get there and they walk into the house and end up going to the ocean. And it's cool because there's some scenes before that point where Helen will essentially go up to characters. And at first they think she's like laughing or cackling. And then they start to realize she's speaking in a language that they can't understand it, but they start to like go into a hallucination, which is usually starts from way above a black ocean and looking down at that ocean and seeing themselves and people they know floating in that ocean, like yelling out obscenities and stuff, and the huge arching humpback of a massive monster within the ocean. So it's like her weird fish language causes them to be transported to a vision stun lock, maybe.
And it's such a cool vision. Like, I love, even when you describe it, it sounds really cool. Like, I want to check that out. I want to see that.
Sounds really scary though in the book.
I think it sounds awesome. But weird shit's happening. It's very Lovecraftian, and there's a lot of layers and twists and stuff within this story.
Oh, another really cool Lovecraft. I'll just bring out the ones that are like super obvious. Is there's like a language, probably that's maybe the one that's being spoken, I'm not sure, but they also write out a language, and like on the cart that the guest first came in to the area a long time ago on, there are runes carved on the wheels, and Rainier uses a language to carve into like the door of his neighbor's house and things he does to try to contain the evil. And it has this detail of when you try to read the language, it shifts and moves and like gives you a headache basically. And that's classic Lovecraft of like, there's this language that when you look at it makes you go crazy and the letters are moving and wiggling and stuff like that. So that was cool.
After all this chaos, basically, in this story, we are brought back to the last third of the book, and we return to Abe and Dan's current time. They end up deciding to still go, even though this story was very much made to deter them from that. And Abe's questioning it, and he's ready to turn around, but Dan is determined to go. So they go, and the water's raging, and it's clearly not a good place for fishing, and he's like, okay, we should go. Dan says no, and he goes anyway. And then we get the end of the story, which I don't really want to spoil, but you should read the book and find out what happens instead of having me with my inability with language to explain it, because Langan does a very good job. He does a good job of bringing in the story elements to the end of the book, but I will say that it did feel, to me at least, that the ending was a little flat because there was no major twist. I felt like we learned everything we needed to in the story that we got from Herman, but then that information was then used pretty much exactly how you would think, perhaps, including the story.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they're told the story at the diner. Hey, don't go to this spot because weird shit's happening. And
people
Dan's
come
like,
back from
we're
the
going
dead.
there anyway. And they go there and weird shit happens. So I think that's a valid criticism. And when I had looked up, done a little research on other people's impressions, most who did not like it, or even those who liked it, said that it felt a little bit of a slog towards the middle, which is a pretty common thing to say about a book, right? The middle is always the hardest, but there is a bit of a repetition of here's information about a place. The characters go to that place and we experience that information again.
Yeah. It also, funny enough, was a bit of a bait and switch because, but it was because you start the book and you're getting the story with Dan and Abe, and you get to know the characters. And I was like, okay, I'm starting to really like Abe. This is going to be a really good read. And then most of the book was not with Abe. And I was like, wait, I thought this was about Abe and Dan. And so when you have this whole other story and you're introduced to new characters, and I felt that they weren't introduced as well, so I wasn't as invested with them. Also knowing that it was a story and not realizing it was going to be the majority of the story. I kind of was just waiting for the story to wrap up and for it to go back to our main characters.
Yeah, you had no heads up as listening to the audiobook.
No.
Because the chapter headings were different in the central story than the surrounding, like in the frame.
Okay.
So I was able... Eventually, I too was like, how long is this tale going to be? And I was able to flip through and tell myself, oh, like, there's another 100 pages. This is the bulk of the book. So psychologically, I was able to kind of settle in, where just listening, you were probably like, how long is this fucking story?
Yeah. But even if I did have that ability, it still was not the story that we were introduced to, which isn't a bad thing. It was very well done. It just was a bait and switch.
Yeah, fair enough. I felt pretty risky, I think. I could imagine this structure would be workshopped. Maybe not workshopped, but if you were to say, hey, I want to do a frame story, but it's like 1/3 frame, 1/3 tale, 1/3 frame is kind of how it's filled out, right? I would imagine it'd be like, that's going to be weird.
Okay, so if I were going to critique this, I guess what I would have said was, well, let's not get too invested in the main characters. We've spent a lot of time digging through their grief and not a lot of time dealing with that grief at the end.
Yeah.
It was mostly dealing with the story. Again, I'm feeling a little repetitive now, but it was. And so I would have said, okay, well, that's fine. We can definitely talk about Abe and Dan, but let's also maybe, I don't know. I don't want to say pull some of that out because I really enjoyed that, but I don't know if there's a way to make it more clear that that's going to happen, or maybe have a break in the middle where we go back to them.
Are you thinking like they could tell part of the tale and then have a little thing like, I don't know, Dan adjusted uncomfortably, or like were they
breaking out of the
breaking
story.
up, like how they're talking at the diner?
Maybe. I don't know. I would have at least suggested playing with that idea, or like, oh, they came back and heard the rest of the story another day or something after a little bit more of them, or I don't know. It just, I have not read many, if any, stories that were structured like this. And it was a little frustrating to me, knowing how much I enjoyed the main character. Well, and are they even the main characters? How much I enjoyed Abe and Dan, and then to have it feel like, just kidding. We're not actually going to really show their story, because then by the time we get back to them at the end, it was kind of like, oh, right, those guys.
Yeah.
Oh,
true.
okay. I'm supposed to care about them again now, even though we haven't visited with them for so long. Now I'm invested in this other story. So
yeah, fair enough. You're like taken from two characters that are, for 100 pages really detailed, and then ripped into a whole new story that goes on for so long that by the time you're out of it, it feels like you've finished the book.
And I don't know if it's just me. You let me know if you have a different perspective, but I felt that the character building within the story was much less in depth, and I didn't get the same attachment to Rainer and the other and Helen and such like I did with Abe and Dan. And maybe that's because this is coming from Abe's perspective, but I just didn't care as much about them. I kept wanting to go back to Abe and Dan.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you said in terms of
long-winded.
It feels more like a tale.
Like my explanation.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it just feels more like a tale, right? It's more like there's this family from Germany who moves to the States, and they get this job and weird things happen. But I don't know. It told in a way where it's like, here's a story about some characters, but opposed to.
Did we need that much detail? I mean, did we really need that entire story to be that detailed? I mean, it's a serious question. It was very well done, but
well, I mean, I'm thinking about it like you could say, oh, you could cut out all the stress on him having to leave Germany, because they go into later on in the story, they're like, this is why he had to leave as a professor. But I think what's interesting there is the kind of cosmic entity in this book is the Leviathan. And I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. It's not like knowing that doesn't really, it's not like what is causing this, right? Anyway, so like the cosmic entity is the Leviathan, which is a biblical creature. There's a really cool chapter in Job where essentially Job is asking God, why have you done all these terrible things to me, right? You know, I think most of us know the story of Job, a character. Okay, no?
I don't.
Okay, overall story of Job is this is a character who God takes everything away from, like kills his entire family, plague on his fields, everything that could go wrong with somebody goes wrong with somebody, and God does it to him. And he's like, why are you doing this to me? How is this divine justice? It's that whole question of, you know, how can there be a God in a world where just people are punished? And it's actually really cool because there's a whole chapter that describes the Leviathan. There's a whole chapter, Job 41, where God answers Job's questions of like, how is this fair? And he's like, can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of it like a bird or put it on a leash for the young women in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? So the idea being here that God is essentially like, okay, Job, I know you think it's mean that I did all this stuff to you, but there's this thing called the Leviathan, which is an enormous, powerful beast that you can't possibly comprehend, and I can tame it. I'm in control of that. So his answer is like, why aren't things nice and fair? His God is like, you cannot comprehend, which is kind of like what cosmic horror is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Sounds a little ambiguous. Isn't he God? Can't he make him understand?
Well, sure, but, you know,
let's not get
riddles. No, yeah. I'm not trying to get into theological discussion here, but I guess that was my long-winded way of coming around to the story of Job is about, one of the things you could say is about a prideful man falling and Rainier leaving Germany. Okay. We don't have to do this part.
You said Rainier again.
I still don't know what to... Reiner? We can skip all that part. I mean, I just randomly talked about the Leviathan.
No, I think that's great. I just was laughing that you said Rainier again.
So that's basically my long-winded way of saying that the Leviathan is holed up in the book of Job as a story that's like, you know... nothing and you cannot comprehend. And Rainier's background, and also kind of like bringing a man down, right? And the background of Rainier, not Rainier, which I just said it, Rainier, is him being like an eminent aristocratic German, and losing all that and going to America and becoming an immigrant starting from the bottom.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's another thing that's interesting about this book is that it is cosmic, but ultimately it does feel more biblical. I think because of the Leviathan, which is clearly like a story from the Bible and probably other mythologies too, I'm sure, but that's the one that I know of, which is different than, you know, like Cthulhu or something like that. So it gives it a different vibe. So
what you're saying is that there's a lot of different influences from Lovecraftian to potentially the Bible.
Not potentially. I'd say it's pretty clearly.
Okay. Very clearly from the Bible.
Well, at least the Leviathan. Is that it? Maybe that's it. I guess it also feels Bible-y because they're like German aristocratic and they do talk about are they Lutheran? I don't remember.
Yes, I believe so. Well, and death and stuff brings up questions of afterlife and that tends to take you to religious places, or at least conversations. But I wouldn't consider this a religious horror book.
No, not at all.
Would you consider it?
I feel like, so I think just personally, I feel like cosmic horror is very linked almost as a reverse image of, I don't know, Christianity or religions like that, because that whole idea is that behind our reality is, you know, heaven and God and all these things, where cosmic horror has the same angle of there are immense forces which we cannot possibly understand, but it's not God in heaven. It's crazy fish shit that'll just drive you crazy.
A fish demon. The spaghetti monster.
I think just my worldview goes more toward that. Not that I think there are like crazy, I don't know, malevolent fish gods, but just more in tune of there is a huge amount that we don't understand about reality or what we think is reality. And if we had any inkling of, I don't know, the true story of where we came from or what caused the Big Bang or there's just whatever we know, or there's so much we don't know. And if we did, it's probably so impossible for us to understand. It would drive us crazy. I don't know.
Or it's just so random. There is nothing to understand and we can't comprehend that.
Yeah. I guess the lack of comprehension, or it's just so complicated. Maybe there, you know, I'm not saying there's even a God behind it.
It's so simple. It just doesn't make sense because it has to be complicated. Because look at how complicated life is. It has to be a complicated answer. It can't be as simple as a fish grew legs and started walking around.
That's what this story is, though.
So this is a story about evolution.
All right, here's a quote, just to put it in there. This is about loss. I'm just going to read this one, and then you can read the book if you want, because most of the quotes I picked were about loss toward the beginning of the book, because that's, you know, when he's really drawing you in. But I really like this passage. This is from Abe, I think before we meet Dan, or maybe when he's talking about Dan. Maybe we'll find out in the quote. Here it is. Loss it's like a ladder you don't know you're standing at the top of, and that reaches down, way down past the loss of your job, your possessions, your home, past the loss of your parents, your spouse, your children, down to the loss of your very life. And I've since come to believe past even that. In that awful hierarchy, what I had undergone, the slow slipping away of my wife over the span of almost 2 years, stood as far above what Dan had suffered, the disappearance of his wife and children in less time than it takes to tell it, as someone who hadn't lost anything at all stood above me. Marie and I had had time, and if a lot of that time had been overshadowed by what was rushing toward us ever closer, at least when we'd been able to make some use of those months, take a road trip out to Wyoming before she was too sick, draw some good out of the bad. You can imagine how much someone in Dan's position might envy me, might hate me for having what I had more fiercely than he might someone whose wife was happily alive. I can imagine that hatred, so kept what I intended as a respectful distance. So that's him like talking about why he didn't approach Dan immediately.
To flip that on its head and your very sad grief quote with another quote that I just loved and really got me enjoying Abe as a person, because it reminded me very much of myself when Abe is talking about Dan coming and joining a conversation. And he says, he'd come up behind me as I was talking. I must have been aware of him, since I didn't jump 10 feet in the air and shout, Jesus. And that made me laugh, because anytime anyone walks into a room, that's pretty much what I do. So I was like, oh, yes, that's Abe. Abe and Am.
Abe and Am. And Dan and Dan. Actually, I hope I don't have a similar fate to the Dan in this book. I'll leave it at that. Or Abe, really, that's actually pretty terrifying too.
I really hope that doesn't happen to you either.
So is this book literary horror, and does it matter? And does anyone care? Obviously some people care, because this is a conversation that has come up.
Yes, I would say yes. I read a lot of different types of horror. This is, I would say, we've thrown around the term cosmic horror, and I feel like if we were going to compare John Langan to Brian Evenson, this is not cosmic horror. But if we were to just talk about it on its own, but as you know, I had to pull in another one of our previous reads. If this were just looked at on its own, I'm not sure. I feel like this is more Lovecraftian horror, but it's definitely literary. There's lots of good play on words. There's some great vocabulary. I think I wrote down one word that I had never heard of before. Smarminess.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, what the hell is smarminess? It is ingratiating and wheedling in a way that is perceived as insincere or excessive. Just the fact that smarminess found its way into this book, yes.
That's literature right there.
This is real literature.
And it's, two guys fishing. How much more literary can you get?
Yeah, and, pulling in Moby Dick and the Bible and, all the topics that are covered. It's not like Such Lovely Skin where it's focused on like coming of age or a specific character's growth through grief or trauma. It's more about the bigger picture, and the people who are in this story are not the focus. It's more about the thing that is in the universe. We are just a speck concept.
Yeah, I think as its very base, if I had to describe cosmic horror, I'd say that it's the insignificance of ourselves compared to the thing we don't understand behind the veil.
Yeah, and I tend to think of cosmic horror more in a science fiction.
Oh, fair enough.
I don't know why, but that's just where my brain...
The vastness of space kind of thing?
Yeah, and the cosmos and stuff. But I guess that would be sci-fi horror? I don't know. It's funny how there are all these sub-genres, but technically there aren't. If you look at the BISEC codes, which is a standard of categorizing different genres of books for publishers to send out books and have them shelved properly, there's only horror. There's no subgenre to horror. Even though,
crazy, because there's totally...
There are so many.
Yeah.
So many. But you do get cozy cat mystery as a subgenre. So maybe it's a bias, but...
There needs to be a scary cat mystery subgenre.
Horror cozy cat body horror mystery. What would that be? So it's fun how horror is kind of this muddy place where it intersects it can intersect all other genres except for maybe romance. Yeah, I can think of a few books with romance. Yeah,
there's a romance in here with Jacob and Lottie.
There's a romance in Maeve Fly, which I would appreciate reading at some point.
You are all about that. We got to do that. So the last topic I mentioned, but I think we kind of covered it, was, does the frame story work? And I kind of agree with you in the fact that I like the structure, and I think it's cool and works as a tall tale, but I do kind of agree that we get this really detailed look at Dan and Abe before they're dropped off for 130 pages or whatever it is, and then it's a little jolting to get back to them.
So I would say it works. It's a fascinating concept. You get a 2-for-1 deal.
Yes, like an old-fashioned donut. That's why I love them.
What? I
eat the outside little ridges, and then I eat the inside.
Oh, wow, you are weird.
2 small donuts, but still.
Okay. I can't imagine why, but I lost my train of thought. No, but I think it works. I think my issue with it was that I was really invested with the characters outside of the center story and not as much with the characters inside the center story. It felt a little wobbly for me.
Yeah.
It felt uneven in the character building. But overall, yeah, I think it's a cool concept. I'd love to read another book that does something like this.
He does. I'm not saying we're going to need to go into his book, but I will mention that he had his short story collection, Children of the Fang and Other Genealogies. He said in the interview, does have some loose connections to the Fisherman. And I think a novel he's working on does. So he has a little bit of a loose mythology there that he plans on branching out on.
Very
Lovecraftian.
Thank you. Wow, I lost that word in my head. Very Lovecraftian of him.
So that's interesting. I might take a look at those when they come out. I think the short story collection is out already, actually. Besides this, have you been reading anything else? What you been looking at?
No, I don't read.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I have read a few books. Actually, currently, I'm not reading any horror. I just finished a novella by Eric LaRocca called At Dark, I Become Loathsome. It was a book. It wasn't really my cup of tea. I think this is the first, and I've read something by him before that I really liked. I've actually read 2 books by him previously. Well, short stories. Things have gotten worse since we last spoke, and They Were Here Before Us. I really enjoyed both of those, and They Were Here Before Us was a really cool bridge between horror and body horror and like eco nature horror. But this last one, At Dark I Become Loathsome, just didn't do it for me. It was, not my cup of tea. Doesn't mean it was bad, just not for me. I also devoured this book, actually, and I had 2 people recommend it to me. One, a high school friend of mine who I don't ever talk to, but we're friends on Goodreads, and our relationship is pretty much we like each other's reading history. But she randomly messaged me and said, "You should read this book. I think you'd like it." And then our really good friend John, who did our logo, he also recommended it to me, and it was so good.
It's like medieval horror, right?
Yeah, Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman, and it was cool. Talk about religious horror, mythology horror. It takes place during the Black Death, so obviously there's death and stuff. It brings in a lot of religious elements and stuff, and especially because I've been reading all this medieval history, which I'm also right now reading a book about the Magna Carta. Actually, it's called Magna Carta by Dan Jones, another Dan Jones book. But because I'm in this mindset right now, this was like the best book ever.
Is it supernatural?
It's mythological.
Okay.
There's like demons and stuff.
Got it. Okay.
It's like hell. Hell comes to earth.
It's one of those books I keep looking at when we go to the bookstore, but I haven't picked up.
The end of the earth kind of vibes.
Cool.
Really fun read. Maybe I'll get us to do that at some point too. And then for funsies, I went through Shirley Jackson's Dark Tales. I love Shirley Jackson, and I had actually not read these short stories. It had been on my to-read list for ever and a day, and I finally said, all right, damn it, just read it. So I did, and she never fails. She's such a good, oh God, she should have written as much as Stephen King. I love her writing. It never gets old for me. Yeah, and then currently, like I said, I'm reading the book called Magna Carta by Dan Jones. I have already put in my plug for Dan Jones. He's great. I've read almost everything he's written at this point, at least nonfiction. And then I'm also just picking up Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History by Bill Schutt, I believe Schutt, which is a science book about cannibalism in the wild and from humans to animals, and like, why is cannibalism a thing? Why is it a taboo? And
why is it a taboo? I can tell you why it's a fucking taboo. Don't eat me. Get away from me.
So there you go. That's a fun read so far. I'm not that far into it, but I had written a paper when I was in grad school about Titus Andronicus and cannibalism in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And so I was like, ooh, I want to read a book about cannibalism. I also recommend reading Titus Andronicus if you haven't, because it's the best Shakespeare there is, and most people don't read it.
Do you really think it's the best? Or is that just because they eat people and you're into that thing?
Well, it's his first first published piece. And it's just so brutal. I loved it. To be fair, I've read a lot of Shakespeare, but I haven't read everything. I haven't read his histories, which, funny enough, since I'm so into history. But from what I've read, yes. My favorite was Othello until I started studying and reading Titus Andronicus. So, it's fucking brutal. It's probably his most brutal. No, it definitely is, yeah. I'm reading a cute book with my son right now, so that's not worth mentioning. But yeah, that's kind of a short list this time around for me.
Oh, yeah? Jesus, that's a short list.
Yeah. I'm only reading, what did I say, 3 books right now?
Yeah.
That's short. Okay, what about you?
The Fisherman, basically.
Okay, well, compared to you.
Let's see, I read that, and then I've been listening to... my immersion has been within... I've just been listening to Kendrick Lamar nonstop for like 3 weeks now.
You've also been listening to some podcasts.
Yeah, well, yes, that's true. Kendrick Lamar has been my deep immersion. I love his GNX album. That album dropped last year when I was with my friend William. And then I saw his performance at the Super Bowl and I was like, damn, that's good. Maybe I should listen to this guy. And that was like 3 weeks ago and it hasn't stopped, which is a lot of fun because I like punk rock. So listening to an incredible rapper and like totally changing genre is just awesome. His lyricism's really good. He's got cool jazzy backgrounds.
And you've been learning part of one of his songs on acoustic guitar, right?
Yeah. Luther, I think is the name of the song.
So that's a fun little...
Yeah, it's cool. It's fun to
caveat.
Like really get engaged with something that is outside the genres I'm usually engaged with. It like really kicks up my creativity and inspiration to like break out of, I don't know, like when I listen to punk bands, I kind of know what to expect. So to change it up is fun. And I've been listening to podcasts, one called Gone Medieval. So I'm
did I influence you?
Yeah, I'm dipping my toes every now and then. It's fun to read about how fucked up we were, how like bad things have always been, and how crazy leaders are.
You say we as if
as humans.
Either of us are British. Oh, okay.
Well, no, just being human. the nightmare of that. Yeah, that's been fun. I just started a podcast about the accusations against Neil Gaiman that came up, and
that's rough.
It's fascinating. It's very complex. Oh, and also not that complex. It's also like, oof, ouch. It's called Master, the Allegations Against Neil Gaiman. It's pretty complicated.
It's crazy to me because I learned about this through, I think it was Tori Amos's Instagram, because I like Tori Amos, and she made some kind of statement or something. And I guess she's good friends with him, or was, or I don't know. I don't know where that's at, but it's so surprising because Tori Amos is such a huge force for good for women and, you know, people being treated properly. Just a weird twist to your...
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he's so famous, right? He has a lot of big connections, right? And it's actually funny that you brought up the word smarminess, because I always thought he was kind of smarmy. It's one of those things, again, where you have a very high-profile man who... It's a man presenting as a feminist who you find out has done some, like, real sus shit to women, and it's just so frustrating. I'm thinking of Justin Sane of Anti-Flag 2, who had, like, 13 women come out against him. And it sucks, because it makes me be, like... untrusting of men who are vocally announce themselves as feminists, right? Because it feels like a cover. It's like a prey. But then, so what? You shouldn't believe a man who stands up for women? You know, it's just one of those things where it's like, it really shows you that there are good and bad people in almost everything. And you have to just be careful, because somebody saying the right things doesn't mean that they actually act out on those things. And I'll just leave it at that, because...
Well, yeah, and it's not just men. Look at J.K. Rowling.
Right.
She says she's a feminist. But she's anti-trans, so I don't know.
Right.
That's clearly not feminist in my book.
Yeah, people are complicated. But, I mean, if you're interested in those allegations or the story around that, I'd recommend it. But it's also true crime with details about, allegations of sexual abuse. So tread carefully if that is something that you would look into. But, yeah, so I guess while I haven't been reading books, I have been... still engaged with different media at this moment.
And what's up next?
Up next, we are reading Where I End by Sophie White. And this one is exciting because it's an Irish author. And we got this book in Ireland.
No, we didn't.
No, we didn't. That's not true. You take it away.
We attempted to get this book in Ireland. We were in some bookshop or another. I don't even remember which one. And we went to a lot of bookshops. It's not that we can't remember the name. It's just, I don't know which one it was. Dan asked about Irish horror, which I was really curious about too, especially after my discoveries about German horror. And someone suggested this book and they said, oh, this is like the best Irish horror. And we looked everywhere. I found a different book by her that I did purchase, but we could not find this book anywhere. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just order it when we get home. And of course, couldn't order it because apparently it was not released in the US yet. So that was frustrating. But just recently, in the last couple of months, it had a US release. So we were finally able to get our hands on a copy without having to pay international fees and crazy shipping to get a book sent here. So yeah, I'm really excited. I love Irish horror films that we've seen. I love Irish folklore. I don't know if there's much folklore in this. I don't really know much about it. I'm kind of hoping to not, so shush. I want to go in blind, but I'm really excited about this. It'll bring back memories of our trip to Ireland.
Oh, it feels like a long time ago now.
Yeah.
Actually, it was just last year, so it doesn't feel that long ago. But, yeah. And it does.
But yeah, so that'll be a fun read.
Yeah, looking forward to it. And we don't know the author or much about the story. It's just Irish horror. So it'll be fun to go into it knowing not much else than that.
Yeah, I suppose actually that's a good point. Neither of us have read this. I think so far every book one of us had read.
Yeah.
So this will be our first book that neither of us had read previously, I believe. This will be interesting.
Yeah.
Hopefully it doesn't suck.
And if it does, we'll try to make an interesting episode about how much it sucked.
We can complain about it. So.
All right. Well, we'll see you for Where I End. And thanks for listening. Bye.
Well, if you've made it this far, then we didn't scare you off. Thanks for listening to Dusk to Dawn, reading horror and weird fiction.
Please rate our podcast, and if you like, follow us on Instagram at Dusk to Dawn Podcast, which is also our Gmail address. Tell us what you liked or didn't like about the show, and let us know if you have any book suggestions. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.